Good morning, everyone. As we gather here virtually today from all across the Ottawa region, we acknowledge that we are located on traditional and ancestral territory from the Algonquin people. We also recognize their longstanding relationship with the land, which remains unceded today.
My name is Megan Ralph,
And I'm Joseph Nair.
and we are grade 12 students at Longfields-Davidson Heights Secondary School. We're the students who have taken the Introduction to Kinesiology in our term 2 this year. We're very excited to be here with Mr. Secor's grade 10 fitness class, and as well as everyone joining this broadcast over the live stream to speak with the owner and program director of the Sports Science Performance Lab here in Ottawa, Travis Wang and Matt Kelly, who will speak to us about the asymmetries and muscle imbalances in youth athletes.
Welcome, Travis. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see a familiar face, or some familiar faces. I was a teacher at Longfields for, since it started in 2009 up until a couple of years ago when I decided to switch gears and start up a physiotherapy company, and then eventually this sports science business. And coincidentally, Megan, who's representing the NCSTA with us this morning, works for us over at our Barhaven location. So thanks for the introduction, guys. This is Matt. He just jumped off the screen for a second. Matt is a physiotherapist and biomechanist on the team. We're hoping to spend some time this morning discussing a little bit about who we are and what we do. We are a bit of a new, just trying to get my presentation queued up here. We're a bit of a new business and approach to clinical rehab and performance in Ottawa. So our parent company is called Holistic Wellness Physiotherapy, and then we have a sports science branch to our company, which is called Sports Science Rehab and Performance. And essentially what we've done is gathered quite an interesting team of sports scientists from across different disciplines with the purpose of providing a pro sport training and rehab environment to the amateur and aspiring athlete in Ottawa. So the purpose would be to give the average everyday person in Ottawa the same access to technological research and human, like professional resources that you might get in those pro sport environments. In terms of how this has come to be, I'll introduce some of the key players on the team, and that might help paint the picture of exactly what it is we're trying to do. So from left to right, there is Ryan Morrison. He's our director of sports science. So his background is that he was the lead physio at the Canadian Olympic Training Center in Calgary, the Canadian Institute of Sport. He was overseeing a few different teams there. From that position, he got the job as director of rehab for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and that was kind of in the era where they were cleaning house, and Brendan Shanahan came in and Kyle Dubas and these guys, and they tried to restart a proper and adequate sports science department at MLSE, the Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment Group. So Leafs being the Leafs and all the money and resources that they have, they decided to hire a team and to scour the globe and figure out what it was that the best clubs in the world were doing, and then to try and bring that back to Toronto. So that was Ryan's job. He was really lucky to travel and spend time in Europe with some of the leading soccer clubs, FC Barcelona, Atletico Madrid, some teams like that are extremely well resourced and financed when it comes to their sports science departments. Also did a lot of work in Australia with the Australian Institute of Sport, which we know is also a pretty world leading setup down there. So he learned from the best. He designed and implemented all sorts of these types of programs and procedures in Toronto. And then what happened is he went and started a family and had some kids and realized that maybe that lifestyle wasn't the best suited for his family. He came back to Ottawa, met up with us, and this Sports Science Rehab and Performance Center is the byproduct now. So we're building out his dream. We've adopted it as ours, and we've got some pretty cool stuff going. After we met Ryan, the next step was to get Dr. Dave Simon on board. So Dave is the head physician for the men's national soccer team. So he's been sort of back and forth to Florida. He's leaving again in a couple of weeks to try and get those guys qualified for the World Cup. Super brilliant guy. He's an orthopedic surgeon and a sports med doctor. He's a super critical part of the team and what we're trying to implement here in the city of Ottawa. Something completely new and unique, never seen before in the city. Other folks that are playing major roles in the team, there's Lisa Glass. She has a master's in exercise physiology. She got that partly at Trinity Western University in BC, and then later finished it off in Calgary at the University of Calgary. She spent some time there teaching methods in fitness testing at the University of Calgary. And then fortunately moved to Ottawa, got connected with us. And as you'll see, as we sort of explain what it is that we do, somebody with an expertise in fitness testing was extremely suitable to how we're proceeding. And then last guy on the slide, although he's not the last guy on the team, is Coach Brent. So Brent Linker is a member of, he's a cast member. So that's the Canadian Athlete Support Team. That means he's working with the Canadian Institute of Sport as a strength and conditioning specialist. So he's done lots of work with pro level athletes and amateur level athletes competing on the world stage. He recently just got back from Russia, where he was a head strength coach in the KHL. And then he also went and had a baby boy. So he's realizing that something like what we're doing is far more aligned with his lifestyle. So really, really privileged to have a group of people that we do assembled. And it allows us to do some pretty unique things that aren't being done anywhere else in the city, and probably in large part not in the country. So we're really excited. Some of the things that we do, try and paint this picture for you guys and get into some cool testing stuff. When we say pro sport resources, we're basically talking, I referenced it before, we're talking about technology resources, we're talking about research resources, and then we're talking about an integrated support team where you have professionals drawing from expertise like across a broad spectrum of service that are all united and working in synergy on developing a scenario for athletes, both from a rehab standpoint, if there's an injury recovery involved, but also from a performance training standpoint, and how do we get people operating and functioning at peak performance, right? You're watching these pro sports and athletes perform at these crazy high levels on TV, and sometimes it's natural to think like, well, these guys are just superhumans, which is partially true, but they also have teams of people working behind the scenes to keep them operating at that level. Like sometimes you see, like I see on TV quite often, guys have superhuman recovery times from really serious injuries. Like I think back to Erik Karlsson severing his Achilles tendon, and he's playing back in the NHL like months later. Like for the rest of us, this would take a year and a half to get back that kind of strength and capacity. How come these guys can do this so fast? In large part, that has to do with the technology and team that are working behind them. So I'll try and get into a little bit about what we do here. Using this technology and these resources, when we get a team or an athlete into our scope of service, what we're trying to do essentially is use some of this technology, which we'll get into shortly, to create a baseline test of this athlete from an orthopedic screen standpoint, so a full medical exam, to performance metrics, to biomechanical assessments, and force production assessments. So this is some of the stuff that's not being done anywhere else. That we're actually gonna do a live demo here. We have a co-op student from South Carleton with us this morning, Griffin, who'll do a live demo. He's come through our program, and we've tested him out before, and we've been monitoring his progress and doing his training now for since September. So he's a living example of how our program can, we can implement things across his training spectrum and get him some serious gains. So we do a baseline test, very similar to what would happen with a pro sports organization. So Ryan built this based on the Leafs preseason physical exam. So at the start of training camp, the guys all show up at camp, they do their physical. That's being, working with the surgeons, the doctors, the physios, the chiros, the athletic therapists, the strength coaches across all those spectrums, do all the testing we can, build up a profile of this athlete. And then from there, this is where we determine how ready they are to compete, how ready they are to train, and which specific strategies we're going to use for each individual athlete to get the most out of that athlete in the preseason, get them ready for the season. So that allows us to, once we have all that information built up about an athlete, that allows us to pass that on to the exercise science team. So that's exercise physiology, biomechanists, and certified strength and conditioning specialists. They can build out really specific program for each individual athlete once they understand who the athlete is, where their strength deficits are, where their greatest need for improvement might be, so that we can get the athlete the biggest gains in the most sustainable possible way, right? So sometimes, like a prime example would be a force velocity profile. So what that does is determine whether an athlete is, like, the bottleneck in their performance is because they're slow or because they're weak, or are they performing really well because they're fast or because they're strong. And usually our failing point in our performance, like our ceiling level performance, is caused by one of those two areas. So what we can do is, through a series of testing, we can determine whether this athlete needs to be working on speed movements or strength movements. But quite often, like, I coached a lot of volleyball at Longfields, quite often we'll get athletes like, oh, I want to jump higher. So they hit the gym and they're doing heavy squats all the time. Heavy squats are really slow movements with high loads. Well, if you're a strength deficient athlete, then that might be a helpful strategy. But if you're a speed deficient athlete, you're just training your muscles to be slower and to be stronger, and that wasn't your problem to begin with. So these are some of the things we can uncover and help build those specific program designs. Again, with our technology and processes, the next thing we can do is help monitor athletes throughout the season. So we're monitoring training loads, we're monitoring the intensity of their workouts, and we're trying to get them in that sweet spot of exertion where they're working. We're working really hard, but working safely, so they're not burning out, they're not creating injuries, and we're peaking them at the right time. So there's performance monitoring strategies. Apart from the performance side, there's also the rehab side. So all these technologies that we're using are very critical when it comes to effective rehab. So lots of times, and as a gym teacher, any of the phys ed teachers on the call can definitely relate to my frustrations as a gym teacher. You get the classic doctor's note that says, my ankle hurts, I'm not participating in gym class today. And my doctor said 6 weeks. And you don't see your doctor again for 6 weeks, and they just come back in 6 weeks like everything is supposed to be okay. Like the doctor has some kind of magical, sort of crystal ball that they can see that 6 weeks would be the time when this athlete is actually rehabbed effectively and can handle, the chaos and the challenge of a sporting event. Alternatively, with all our technology, we can actually make strength and balance and symmetry determinations to decide when an athlete is actually specifically ready to handle different phases. So when can they go back to controlled training? When can they go back to practice? When can they go back to game simulation? And when can they handle the impact and chaos of a real game? So we have all those stages and phases built into our rehab programming. Ultimately, this is all done to get to create a competitive advantage in our athletes, in our clubs that we work with. All tied together, can really push a group of people or an individual athlete over the top. That's the general purpose. Kind of leads us to our last bucket or category of things that we do, and we can actually use all our technology to market athletes to either pro teams, national teams, or post-secondary schools. So many of the schools in the States are using all the exact same technology that we do. Almost all of the soccer clubs in Europe, NFL teams, NBA teams are using the exact same technology that we are. So we can actually streamline athlete development and align it with those clubs. So for example, if Griffin, our co-op student, he's digitally trying out for the men's national junior national volleyball team, which is a cool opportunity. They'll never get a chance to see him play. They're going to try and run a program and choose athletes. Well, what we can do is we can send along some really serious performance metrics to the team, and the coach of that program is affiliated with the national team, sports science. They can actually speak our language, and they can get a really good picture of who Griffin is as an athlete, and make a determination if they think he's national level caliber. So the last thing we do with our tech is try and streamline communication and speak the same language with the super high-end clubs around the world. Okay, so back to that. I'm going to give Matt a chance to speak in a second. Matt's a super smart guy, much more entertaining than me. But so our base level service that we do if somebody comes to the clinic is something called the complete athlete screen. That's that baseline testing that would happen at the pro sport level in training camp. So what we're looking for is 3 general things in the complete athlete screen. We're looking to establish that performance baseline. We're trying to evaluate injury propensities, and then we're trying to perform a gap analysis for performance optimization. So we're trying to look for those bottlenecks in performance where we can unlock new levels of performance. So today, because we're limited on time, what we wanted to talk about was evaluating injury propensities and how asymmetries can create injuries in youth athletes. So this is some of the stuff that our technology will flag. So when we talk about asymmetry, if we're defining what asymmetry means in grade 5 math class, it means there's a line of symmetry between a shape and both sides are identical. Not so different in biomechanics and in exercise physiology. There's, you know, different sides of our body, left side versus right side. How symmetrical are those? Not in appearance, but in force production and mobility, range of motion, those kinds of things. So we're looking for balanced athletes. When athletes are not so balanced, it doesn't go so well. So what we can do is detect symmetries through our technology. Some of the technologies we have on site are the Nordboard hamstring testing system. That's the one we're going to test drive this morning and do a live demo with you guys up. Griffin, you should cue that up and get ready to go. Maybe stretch those hammies out. Then we have also in the clinics, we have dual force plate systems, which is going to test jumping metrics and the symmetries of all sorts of things actually with the force plates. And then the last one we have is the force frame system. So what I'll try and do, and I don't know, can you guys see, like I want to turn my camera and see, you guys can maybe pin my my graphic there, and we'll introduce Griffin in a second. Griffin, can you jump in the camera there? Here he is. Okay, so this is the Nordic strength system, the Nordboard, and we'll see if we can get this going. So what we're going to do, you try and get this going, Matt. I'll explain it. Yep. So Griffin, you want to jump on? So what we're going to do here is we're going to test Griffin's eccentric hamstring strength. I'm hoping you guys can see the screen. Megan, can I get a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Okay, good stuff. So the way this is set up here is Griffin's knees are fixed on a platform if it's kind of hard to see on camera, and his ankles are hooked in. So we have eccentric force plate testing happening at the site of his heel. So what's going to happen, Griffin, do you want to do a demo that's not recorded? So he's going to gradually fall forward. His hips are going to stay perfectly straight, and his back is going to stay straight. So if ever you get a chance to do a test like this, you're going to potentially find this really uncomfortable in your hamstrings. All the force is definitely being driven through those hamstrings as the hamstring lengthens. Are we in business there, Matt?
No, it's not.
I think we have to turn the Nordboard on. Okay. So what we're looking for when Griffin does this test, so it looks like they're pretty live. And I'm not sure you can see the force trace on the TV. What we're watching as he does this test, Griff, let's do like 3 reps, please. What we're watching for as he does this test is we're looking for symmetrical forces on both sides. So right now he's outputting 384 newtons of his left leg and 389 newtons of force with his right leg during these movements. And I'll see if I can bring you in nice and close. Take a look. Do one more, Griffin. You can see the live force trace happening. Okay, thanks, Griffin. So what we're doing there is we're seeing the difference in force between right leg and left leg forces throughout the full range of motion, throughout the full exercise. And what ends up happening once we scrub all the data and get the artificial intelligence stuff working on it is we can actually watch the different rates of fatigue, and we can watch, that symmetry level at its peak. Is that really bad? There's something called an impulse, which is a measure of how much force happens over the full rep. Like how much force is actually different between left foot and right foot. And then there's a lot of research base that discusses how that relates to possible injuries. I'm actually going to let Matt talk for a second here about what healthy and unhealthy hamstrings look like and what impact they have on injury and sport performance.
Yeah, thanks, Trev. So for healthy hamstrings, we definitely want about 2 times body weight in strength. And for symmetry, so from right side to left side, we want less than 8% difference. So if your right side is producing 100 newtons in force, we want your left side to be at least 92% of that. So 92 newtons in, or 8% of that, 92 newtons in force. So I think one of the big examples for strength in hamstrings would be in sprinting. So for those of you who have taken a physics class, Newton's law of action and reaction, where when you apply a force to an object, you get the same force back in the opposite direction. That's what happens in sprinting. We apply force down into the ground, and we get the same force applied back up into the body. So when we sprint, we get anywhere over 5 times body weight in force being applied back up into your legs. So if your hamstrings aren't strong enough, so ideally 2 times body weight, there's a good chance that you could get an injury because of all the force coming back up into your legs. For symmetry, I kind of like to think of it as a car. So if you're driving a car with different sized tires on each side, your car's going to be slanted. First, it's not going to perform well, and second, you're going to have problems with it down the road. So same thing with symmetry of your hamstrings. If you have one hamstring that's stronger than the other, it's probably not visible to the naked eye, which is why we use a lot of this technology to come up with these numbers and identify this stuff before it becomes a problem. But if you're running with different strengths from left to right, you're probably not performing at your best potential, and you're probably at higher risk of injury because of that asymmetry.
Yeah, so some of the research that we have on specifically on the hamstring asymmetries and the Nordic hamstring test. So it's really prevalent in the soccer world overseas. The use of this Nordic hamstring test is being done before the match and oftentimes at halftime to monitor, like live monitor how the athletes are generating strength in their hamstrings, because obviously things can happen throughout a match or a week or a season that would affect this. The best example probably that you guys would be familiar with would be the Kawhi Leonard load management stuff that you heard about when the Raptors were winning their NBA championship. So it kind of sounded like when you're watching SportsCenter, it kind of sounded like Kawhi needs a rest, so he's going to take a nap today instead of play his game. But in reality, behind the scenes, they're doing these force metrics like every day, and they're making sure that he's staying in that safe and healthy range so that he doesn't re-injure. I think it was a lower body thing, like a quad thing or something in Kawhi's case. They just know that the likelihood, once you cross that threshold of the like 8, 10, 12, and sort of north of 12% is where we start considering maybe resting a guy or getting one of the athletes into the gym and doing some exercise training to get them back into that safe and healthy threshold. And then just sort of monitoring that over time to make sure that those changes in injury don't show up. So, you know, some of the research says it's as high as like a 400% chance of injury or re-injury to hamstring once they're north of 13% symmetry. So that 13% line is important to us. It's important to the athletes. A 4 times likelihood of a hamstring injury is pretty extreme. And if you actually did some poking around in the research on field sports, specifically soccer, lots of information on rugby and tackle football as well. Hamstring and posterior chain injuries are by a long shot the most prevalent injuries in all those sports. So prevalent means common. So the most common injuries are happening to our hamstrings, to our knees, to our lower back, things like that. And you could you can tie all those things to the health and the symmetry of your hamstring. Obviously, that doesn't account for catastrophic injuries. If you get slide tackled and tear your ACL, that's not because you had asymmetrical hamstrings. We're talking about like soft tissue injuries that happen as a product of overuse or strains or sprains and that kind of a thing. So I'm going to get into some examples of athletes that we have tested on site. And I'm also going to draw a bit of a connection between what we do in our gym classes and our sport specific training and how that might be impacting these hamstring asymmetries. So subject A there is that is an extreme example of hamstring asymmetry. So their left leg wants to do 129% of the work that the right leg wants to do. And that is an extreme example. And the reason being is this person is recovering from a ACL surgery. So this guy tore his right ACL. And for those of you who don't know, the procedure to repair your ACL requires, in his case, it required the surgeon to take a piece out of his hamstring and use that piece to repair to recreate the ACL joint. So naturally speaking, this guy's been rehabbing for a while. He's probably 6 months post-op. We would expect a major difference in his hamstring strength. And actually, this is an example of what we would use for return to play and return to training determination, because the hamstring has a major role in keeping that knee stable. So when you have an ACL tear, the propensity for your kind of femur to drive forward without the ACL there is really high. So the hamstring is pulling that back into place. Without that hamstring strength, then that ACL will be super vulnerable to re-injury. So we're trying to monitor this client of ours to make sure that he's generating enough force before we ask him to do exercise and movements that would require any kind of plyometrics or leaping and bounding. You know, if we put him back in that environment right now, he could very likely re-tear his ACL, and that's a major life-changing event. Subject B is that's actually a normal athlete. So that person's not in a rehab state. So they have not been injured. This is just sort of walking off the street. Let's see how this athlete's doing. And they have developed what we would consider a significant level of concern over their hamstring health. So they've got a 16.6% asymmetry and imbalance. So right away, as we work towards their programming and their exercise prescription, we want to address this quickly so that when this person goes out to compete, they don't end up hurting themselves. So the big question that I have is why is this happening? So I did mention that there's tons of research in the soccer world, tons of research in the rugby world, but because this technology is all pretty new, it hasn't necessarily been applied amongst other sports-specific scenarios. But I did start to notice a trend, and in all fairness, it started with myself and my own body and my own thinking. But then I started to measure athletes from different sport disciplines, and I started to question, well, how does asymmetry develop? So almost everybody's coming in with some degree of asymmetry. And how come one leg is dominant over the other leg? And I started asking myself these questions, and I started thinking of the specific examples of these athletes. I started to realize that it could potentially be tied to excessive sport-specific movements that are done in high repetition, and then often that have high frequency, high load, high volume exercises could potentially be creating and cultivating these imbalances. And then I thought to myself, as a coach, how am I creating these scenarios, and how might I be unintentionally creating asymmetries and injury risk amongst the athletes that I'm coaching? So specifically, I'm going to share some testing with you from an elite ultimate frisbee player, an elite baseball pitcher, and an elite track and field sprinter. And then I'm going to make a conjecture here, an unproven, non-research conjecture, and I'll let you guys consider the validity of my argument. But I think we can all probably look at the way that these sports are practiced and see how they could be tied, and I'll get Matt to help me out with that, see how they could be tied to creating asymmetries. So if we look at an ultimate Frisbee player, and I'm going to show you one in a minute. You have the example of the gentleman in the white shirt there performing what's called a flick. So he's heading towards a very deep lunge position, and you'll notice his right foot is going to hit the ground. At that moment, there's going to be a tremendous force driven. Well, maybe Matt, you could talk about the biomechanics of that lunge and how that's creating hamstring force.
Yeah. So anytime you do a lunge, you need your muscles to stabilize the knee. So in order to stop the knee from continuing to bend until he basically falls, he needs his quads, his hamstrings, his calf, his glutes to all fire, and create a counter force to stop himself from falling. So every time he does that, it leads to adaptations. The muscles adapt, and over time they get stronger to tolerate that load better. The problem is he does it all on the same side. So we're getting that asymmetrical right to left strength ratio that we talked about earlier, whereas in this case, the guy in the white shirt, his right hamstring is going to be a lot stronger than his left.
Okay, so from a coaching standpoint, and I did coach Ultimate at Longfields. When you're trying to build the foundations, the technical foundations of a sport like Ultimate, and we start coaching it now at grade 7, and in Ottawa, Ultimate's actually one of the fastest growing sports, and Ottawa could easily be considered one of the world capitals of Ultimate Frisbee. If we started coaching this at like the grade 6, 7 level, the actual movements and training of throwing is going to be like single-sided. If you're right-handed, right-sided, repeat high force lunges over and over and over and over again. So the actual like technique, if you've never coached Ultimate, is to establish that pivot foot, and then you're going to fake deep lunging. You want low releases on the flick side, and you're going to switch over to the backhand side. And it's literally like to actually throw a Frisbee, you might be doing 5 or 6 lunges per throw. To take a kid through a practice, we might have the guys and girls in a typical morning throwing the disc 500 times, and then you do that 4 practices a week. You do that for a year. All of a sudden, you're 400,000 reps in on a single-sided right-sided lunge. So it's not a mystery as to how you might cultivate this imbalance if you haven't been intentional about training the opposite side. A second example would be a baseball pitcher. So I'll show you some of the metrics from a baseball pitcher, and the biomechanics here are similar. So this pitcher that you're looking at on the left side of the screen is a right-handed pitcher, and you can see that his push-off, it's all one-sided. So he's loading up that leg, and he's absorbing as much downward force as possible, and he's generating as much forward force as possible, but he only does that on one leg. And as we understand throwing mechanics, like it would be absurd for a coach to say like, okay, today we're going to throw with our left hands for practice, and we're going to try and develop the other side. Like that's not something we're ever going to program in from a technical training standpoint. So that means the implications for our physical training and our conditioning programming should take into consideration the in-sport specific movements that might be building up these asymmetries over time. The other one was the track and field athlete. Sorry, she's an 800-meter runner, and if you consider the mechanics of sprinting and track and field, we don't ever like reverse the direction of the run, right? So she's running she demonstrated some major hamstring asymmetries, and I started to ask, well, why would she have those? Well, it's because she turns left all day. Like all she does is 800-meter runs. So she's constantly running around in a circle in the same direction. So it's not surprising that we might find, years later that she has built up, in fact, cultivated an asymmetry and imbalance. So here's Aiden. So some of you might know him if you're in the Longfields community. He's a Longfields grad. He has a pretty successful Ultimate Frisbee career going. After high school, he made the junior national team, and he actually got named tournament MVP at the Junior World Championships, which is pretty cool. I think Canada lost in the final to the US, but pretty neat for him to go on and do something like that. And then he did play one summer on I guess it's a pro contract or semi-pro contract for the Ottawa Outlaws team. There hasn't really been another season since then because of COVID. He also happens to be playing volleyball for Guelph University, and he sort of falls under that super athlete kind of a person. When we look at his metrics from his hamstring strength test, so I bet you it was hard to see on the TV when we did the live demo, but here's a screenshot of Aiden's test. So the orange line is a measure of Aiden's force from his right leg, and the blue line is his force from his left leg. So as he's performing that eccentric hamstring test, his right leg is doing a lot more of the work. So he is in that, I think he's 12, 13% asymmetry in his hamstring testing. And if you actually go back into his health history at Guelph and volleyball, as he's training now at this elite level and he's doing training every single day, he's got a lot of right hip problems and low back problems. You can't say for sure that that's coming from his hamstring, but you can make a pretty good argument to say that if we want to help him correct these problems over time, we should be addressing the left-sided strength and trying to correct this specific issue. That's not actually a problem when he's playing ultimate. When he's handling, it's actually really good that his right leg is super strong. The problem and the injury comes in after he's thrown the disc, and now he's sprinting upfield, he's changing direction really fast. So that on the throwing side, it's great to have this super strong right side, but then the game obviously doesn't just involve sprinting. It's one of the reasons why in baseball, like we talked about the baseball pitcher who's next. So there's our elite baseball pitcher. This pitcher is a left-handed pitcher, by the way. It's one of the reasons why maybe they don't want pitchers batting and base running in pro baseball, because these guys are getting hurt quite frequently. They're very specialized in their training for pitching, a constant high volume of reps. Then to ask them to sprint, stop, start, you would expect that injuries would be creeping up. And then because they're such a valuable asset financially, the league just pulls them out and they don't bat in one of the leagues in Major League Baseball. He's a designated hitter. So here's our baseball pitcher, lefty guy. He's within what we would consider a safe asymmetry. So I think his total impulse difference, if I remember correctly, was like 9%. But this is the kind of athlete that we'd want to monitor because he's kind of creeping up there. And if you consider the actual definition of asymmetry and how asymmetry would work, if we don't intervene at 8 and 9% and start being intentional about programming it, then the asymmetries only get worse. They perpetuate their own problem. So when your one side wants to do more work than the other side, if you're doing, like, let's say we're doing a squat, for example, on a squat rack, heavy squat weights. Well, if your right leg wants to do more work than your left leg, then it will do more work and it will get stronger. And the gap that was 8 or 9%, if we don't correct it, will grow 10, 12, 15, and then we get injuries at some point down the road. And I did have a metric there for some guy who is in his retirement stage of sport, who is left with a bit of a disaster and is way up into the 16, 17% differences. And, you know, should this athlete go out and start sprinting around, you'd expect them to get hurt pretty quickly. So when it comes to solutions, what are we going to do about this from a coaching standpoint, or for those of you that might be interested in getting into either the strength and conditioning industry, the physio industry, rehab industry, sports medicine, anything like that? What we want to start doing is programming single-sided, like one leg, just specifically when it comes to hamstring, we want to be doing single leg hamstring exercises instead of 2-leg hamstring exercises, and giving a chance for the weaker limb to develop that resiliency and that strength over time. So this guy who's demonstrating right now a hamstring slider with one leg would be a perfect example of something that we might want to start programming into an athlete that we're seeing asymmetries creep in. It's really common for a strength coach or a coach of any kind, or in an exercise class, for us to do like hamstring curls, but usually we're kind of doing that. Somebody's holding your ankles in place and you're doing the same movement we do on the Nordic hamstring test. Like, oh, we want to develop good hamstrings, so we'll do an exercise like that. But that's not actually going to help with the imbalance. That's going to help with the overall strength, but it's not going to help with the imbalance. And we might be doing our athletes a bit of a disservice. We won't watch him demonstrate his exercise. So I think that's lots of talking on our end. If anybody has any questions, Matt would love to answer them. He can give you better information than I can, but yeah, I don't know, Megan, how you guys want to do that. Can people raise hands, or how do we want to go about that?
We had some questions that have come in. Along with that, we've also had questions like previously. So I guess I'll go for the first question, and then Megan, you'll go with the second one. So first question that we have is kind of how can you identify these muscular imbalances? Pretty much.
How can you identify them?
Yeah, that's one of the questions. Yeah.
So how could you identify them, or how do we?
I guess, well, I guess how could you guys identify them? The question's pretty vague.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said earlier, it's hard to identify. It's hard to see to the naked eye, right? Like if you're watching somebody run, you're probably not going to be able to tell if they have an imbalance, if they have weak hamstrings. So that's one of the things that we do here that's different than what most places do. Is we have the devices that can actually pick up these imbalances and give us the numbers on what's different and what should be worked on.
Yeah, like traditionally, like in an orthopedic exam, like in a traditional physio clinic, there would be a series of tests that can give you a bit of a measure, but not down to the percentages that actually give us that super valuable and critical information. So often they'll do like they'll be holding your leg and they'll say, okay, resist against my arm. And the professional is feeling for what they think will be about the same force. But obviously, I mean, how precise can a therapist be while they're holding on? Like they could definitely notice a really significant difference, but the fine tuning be pretty tough without some of this super medical grade technology. So.
Okay, another question is what are some common, I guess you could say, some common undertrained muscles or some common muscular imbalances that you commonly see like in athletes?
I mean, the hamstrings is definitely a big one with a lot of field sport athletes. So like Travis said, soccer, rugby, football, basketball, that kind of stuff. Anywhere where you're sprinting, hamstrings is definitely one of the big ones. Another one would be the glutes, so like your hip muscles. We often see that in younger athletes where they have weak glutes, which can also lead to hamstring problems later down the road. If they're not using their glutes to do their activities, they could be overworking their hamstrings. And if their hamstrings are already weak, then that can definitely lead to problems.
Super sport specific, right? Yeah. Like the hockey guys and girls or ringette would be the similar, probably figure skating and speed skating as well. Anything where you're skating, the athletes will have a tendency to get hip groin ratio differences. When we did all the testing for the Ottawa Fusion Volleyball Club, we found a very high percentage of kids had an imbalance, both boys and girls, by the way, like a very similar number. So it wasn't a gender thing. The balance between internal rotation and external rotation of the shoulder was often way off in the attacking arm. So what that ends up doing is creating rotator cuff injuries. They're really good at generating force on the internal rotation movement, but really bad at slowing down and stopping the force on the external rotation movement, which is where the rotator cuff injuries are happening. If you walk around, by the time kids are graduating grade 12 from local high schools, you watch the shoulder warm up and you probably got half the athletes cringing in pain because their shoulders are messed up. These are the kinds of things that you could program early on and intervene early to get ahead of these injuries.
Another question we have coming in is, can your height affect your chances of having muscle imbalances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely think so, especially when you're younger, right? So when you're going through like a growth spurt, and you grow really fast, your bones grow faster than your muscles. So that can definitely lead to imbalances. I think for the most part, it's not necessarily related to your height, but I think it can have an impact during like a growth spurt or something.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Matt's answer that, like, from the data that we've seen, it'd be more tied to stage of development than it would be to height. So we just finished off some testing with the Futuro Soccer Academy, and we actually looked at trends across male trends and female trends across the cohorts of ages. And the actual symmetries were pretty similar across like the 8, 9, 10, 12-year-old group. And then once we got sort of north of 12 and we hit those real active puberty ages, we saw the asymmetries spike for like sort of 4 years. So I mean, that's not conclusive data. We can't produce a research paper on that because we only tested 40 athletes, but it was really clear that there was a stage issue where there was more symmetries going on. It's definitely something like that requires further research. Lots of stuff that we're trying to do here.
Interesting. Another question that just popped in was, what activities or exercises can students do at home to keep symmetry within their body?
Yeah, that's kind of a vague question. It really depends on what the asymmetry is, right? Like if we're talking, Travis had a good example with the hamstring, with the one-legged slider, with the shoulder doing some band external rotation. Like Travis said, with the volleyball players, a lot of them are strong internally rotating, but not strong externally rotating. So, yeah, it really does depend on the asymmetry for like specific exercises.
Yeah, so I mean that's where like you really got to understand your sport and what you're doing, and you got to realize if you're specializing really early, then you just want to sort of ask yourself like, well, what movement am I doing like a lot of? We found in soccer, we find some of these asymmetries creeping in, that their left sides, if they're right-footed, their left sides tended to be stronger than their right sides. And that's most likely because that's their plant foot. Like they're driving a lot of force into that foot while they're trying to strike the ball. So the earlier you can sort of see that in your own sport-specific, training, the earlier you can consider how can you offset that with a movement and just build that into your warm-up, build that into your cool down, just so that you can sort of be monitoring that over time and hopefully it never becomes a problem.
Yeah, I think that also brings up an interesting point where a lot of kids will play a full season of whatever sport they're doing, and then they just keep playing through the off season, right? They never take the time to actually stop playing their sport and train, where they're constantly feeding into that asymmetry. So I think another part of that would be to take a break from your sport and train kind of like Travis said, almost like the opposite movement of what you're normally doing. So if you're training, if in your sport you're planting a lot on one leg, do a lot of work on your other leg.
Right.
So when athletes specialize early, do you recommend that athletes like cross train doing different sports when they're younger?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of a large issue in sports these days is early specialization, where you get kids playing one sport year round. So I would definitely recommend playing multiple sports in different seasons, so that you're not constantly playing the same sport and then again feeding into those same asymmetries of that sport.
Yeah, I mean, there's two answers to that question, because like I tend to agree with Matt, and like for my own kids, that's the way I would like to do it for them. But different families are going to make different choices, and different clubs have different perspectives on things. But if you're a club that wants to promote year-round technical training and they want early specialization, then you would, as a parent or as an athlete, you would hope that that club is being very intentional with like a very smart strength and conditioning program to help offset some of those imbalances that are inevitably going to happen if they're not being intentional about it. So it's not that it's impossible. It just takes maybe an organization like ours or somebody else in the city that really understands what they're doing and what the impact of early specialization is.
Right. Another question coming in. So when an injury occurs and like during that rehabilitation period, different muscular imbalances could occur. So I guess once an athlete is back to almost full health, or they've fully rehabbed from the injury, how do they get back to full health? Because obviously one side, if one leg is injured, how do they get back so both legs are symmetrical when it comes to strength and performance?
I mean, I think that's the whole goal of the rehab, is to get them back so that both sides are symmetrical. And again, like I said earlier, it's hard to identify that sometimes. So having the technology that we have here really helps with making sure that athletes do get back. So going back to the hamstrings, a lot of athletes have problems. One of the biggest predictors of hamstring injuries is a previous hamstring injury. And I think part of the reason is because we aren't, in general, we don't do a very good job of measuring their hamstring strength. Like Travis said earlier, a lot of times it's just a therapist who is pushing on the leg and judging whether or not they're symmetrical. So having this technology here definitely helps make sure that athletes are symmetrical and ready to go back to their sport and perform at their best.
Yeah, and sometimes kids being kids, or actually even adults, like anybody really that gets hurt and really loves their sport, they're going to use pain as the indicator of sort of return to play. Like, it doesn't hurt anymore, I'm going to go play, and that can often be a really damaging thing. Like one of my best friends, he's a teacher in the board, Mike Elliott, and he's a coach. He had an ACL surgery, reconstruction, probably a year and a half, was feeling pretty good, did a whole bunch of physio, got himself all fixed up, was wearing his brace and everything. And it was kind of, well, Mike, we need a spare for our volleyball team. Like, how's your knee doing? And he's like, oh, it's pretty good. I'd love to play. And the first jump, he went up to spike the ball, and his first attack attempt, he re-tore his ACL, and it changed his life and his family's life. He's got kids. Like, it's a real sad tragedy when something like that happens. That, from where I sit now, like 5 years later, like, that was a preventable injury. We could have known that would have happened.
Alrighty, perfect. And one last question: how do athletes get involved with your clinic?
You can take that one.
Oof. That's so there's a pandemic happening right now, as you might have heard. So sports has been really tricky to get things going. So we are running summer training programs. So we have a hockey training program starting next week with all their medical exams. We come in, we do all the testing, we build programs for them, and we train them on site. We actually have a full gym training studio here now. So the full setup, the high performance training center is going to open permanently in September, but we're sort of suited to run high performance programming year round. Our website is sportsciencecanada.com. The best way, if people are interested in sort of pushing themselves to the next level and understanding a little bit about injury prevention, would probably be to email us or direct message us on Instagram, and we can get in touch with, whether it's you personally as an individual or you want to get your club involved. There's lots of conversations to be had. If you're like actually injured and need rehab, that's a bit of a different story. You can just email us and we can get you an appointment. But if we're talking to the full spectrum of a sports science service for you and your family and your team, it's going to take a little work, but we would be excited to chat with you and get you involved. And hopefully, like my number one hope with this conversation was to maybe inspire some of the students across the board to engage in health sciences as a career option. And that's something we'd always be happy to chat with kids about as well, as you look at different fields, whether it be on the strength and conditioning side or the medical side or the rehab side. It's a pretty rewarding and fulfilling job, and lots of really great people to work with, and then the ability to empower clients as they come in and see them make real gains in their rehab or their performance. It's a pretty rewarding line of work, and we'd love to play a small role however we can in helping you line up with the proper education or some workplace experience or whatever. We'd love to get to know you and answer any questions you have about how to get involved in something like this.
Awesome. Thank you. First, thank you so much, Travis and Matt, for everything you've done. Thank you for your time and answering all the great questions. We have learned a lot about asymmetries and muscular imbalances and different ways for us to improve on our training. On behalf of the NCSSA, SSAA, we really appreciate you guys speaking with us today. Have a great day, and thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us. Appreciate the time. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.